Hello. Welcome to Surviving Stalking, a podcast about, surviving stalking, as well as other forms of intimate partner abuse. My name is Teri Faragher, and I and my colleagues, TK Logan and Hillary Sykes, will be your podcast host. In this series, we will interview survivors and people who work with survivors to explore some of the most misunderstood aspects of intimate partner abuse, such as, why do people stalk, abuse, and terrorize other people? What is the impact of intimate partner violence on children? What can you do about intimate partner violence, whether you are a victim or you care about someone being abused? And most importantly, how do survivors find the strength and courage to break free from abusive partners? This series will contain graphic descriptions of violence and abuse and may not be suitable for all listeners. It was produced by Outrage Us, a web-based nonprofit that works to channel the outrage of gender-based violence into strategies and actions to stop it. You can listen to this and all previously aired Surviving Stalking episodes at outrageus.org. Today we are going to listen to and discuss a pre-recorded interview with Mark Wynn as he recounts his childhood with a stepfather who abused, isolated, and manipulated him, his mother, and his 4 siblings for 10 years, and how they finally escaped. As a child, Mark wasn't able to stop the abuse his stepfather inflicted on him, his mother, and his siblings, but as an adult, he dedicated his life as a police officer to stopping abusers, sexual predators, and stalkers from terrorizing other people. Over 30 years ago, he helped initiate a domestic violence division in the Nashville Police Department that became a model for departments across America. Now retired, Mark is the most recognized law enforcement trainer on intimate partner violence and stalking in the world. We have divided our interview with Mark Wynn into 2 episodes of the Surviving Stalking podcast. Episode 1 focuses on Mark's personal story as a child traumatized by an abusive stepfather, and Episode 2 taps into Mark's deep well of knowledge regarding law enforcement interventions in domestic violence and the impact of those interventions on victims and their children. We will play segments of Mark's interview, followed by me and TK Logan discussing the issues he raises. Let's start with Mark telling us his personal story.
I'm the youngest of 5, maybe 4. It was 4 in that age, 4 or 5 years old. And my mother met a very handsome, charismatic man from Texas. We were Tennesseans. He was a crop duster, very smart man, pilot, musician, and real handsome. He was almost like a movie star. It was a rush romance, and they married, and shortly after that we were all moved to Texas, and then it started. My happy moments are moments I have with my siblings and my mother, but never with him. He was big guy, about 6'2", 220, tough, West Texas fellow. Father was abusive to him, I later found out. And he knew no other way. It was just the way he was taught, the way he was raised. He solved his problems and his arguments, and his day-to-day life was used by force and threat, and he used it well. He was very good at it. He started off slow with yelling and screaming, and then pushing and slapping, and then he went into bone breaking and concussions to near-death experiences over a 10-year period. And on top of all that, he was an alcoholic, and he would drink and stay drunk for weeks on end, lay in his bed, urinate, defecate on himself. So we had to survive around that.
There is so much to unpack in Mark's story. The trauma of living with a man who abused and terrorized this entire family with 5 children for 10 years. The tactics he used to isolate and manipulate them. How his alcoholism sowed confusion about why he abused them. And Mark's mother's decision to risk escaping with 4 kids and little else. When Mark describes it as escaping, he doesn't talk about leaving. He talks about escaping the terrorism that they were living.
Yeah, I agree, Teri. I think one of the things that really strikes me about how he talks about this experience was the focus on the physical abuse and the extreme physical abuse. As you mentioned, the isolation, there's multiple ways. I would say what I call the abuser's kind of toolbox. There are 3 main kind of groups of tools. One is to create dependence on the abuser. So he controls all of the resources. The second is sort of this induced stability or control over time. They often have standards for house cleaning. And again, Mark didn't talk a lot about this piece, but what she can wear, what she can't wear, what she can say, what she can't say, sort of what we call micromanagement of everyday living. And then the monitoring to make sure that she's following his rules. And then the third piece is sort of this creating dread. And that's that threats and the physical abuse for sure. But another thing that kind of strikes me with just what he's talking about is how they're just going along and then all of a sudden this severe violence, so sort of, I'm sure there was a lot of mood changes or her never knowing what to expect next, the degradation and humiliation piece, often the sexual assault that comes with that. And so these things create this culture where it gets difficult for women to even think about escaping, which takes a lot of planning and a lot of energy in order to do.
In addition, in another part of the interview, Mark talked about the lack of resources, particularly at the time, because this was some years ago. But a lot of resources have developed since then, of course, but people still find themselves in communities all over America maybe not finding the resources that they need. I do think there's a lot more out there at this point, and I do believe that more people are escaping the abuse earlier than they were able to at another point in our history of domestic violence in this country.
Oh, I definitely think you bring up a really good point there about how society sort of collaborates with abusers in a way to continue that entrapment. So then you've got the police who threatens to arrest the victim. And then what happens to the children, the child protective services issues that you could run into even then, but also still today. And yeah, absolutely. What were shelters around? They were probably not advertised as much and not as well supported as they are today. But even still, like you said, there's still people who don't know, and there are still shelters that are full. Then what happens, and so absolutely, I think that we have to consider that, or how even sometimes women who are being victimized go to their church, which maybe they're allowed to go to, and then people are like, oh, well, maybe if you were just a better wife, that wouldn't happen.
Right. And unfortunately, we still hear that. I do think the isolation piece you talked about is really important in Mark's story, because it was quick involvement, a quick romance. He was very charismatic, as Mark describes him, and she was a single mom with 5 kids, and he kind of swept her off her feet and carried her away from all of her support, her family, her friends, her community, and he was a pilot and sprayed crops in Texas, and they moved from town to town. So, they never were able to stay somewhere long enough to develop a support system that might have provided a place for them to flee or just helped them get out in some way or protect them in some way.
You bring up something that I would like to pull out a little bit more, and that's sort of the quick progression to a relationship, which I actually call the bait and switch. We all sort of, when we're dating someone, put our best foot forward. Like, that's very normal behavior. But I know how some women who've been entrapped in these relationships talk about how just like these men make them feel so special, the center of the world, like no one's ever loved me like that before. They're not realizing how the boundaries are getting kind of meshy with this. And then here she has like 5 kids, so the whole idea that he was accepting of that had to go a long way, because she loved her kids. I mean, you can just tell from his story how much she loved those kids.
I can't say how many times I've heard women say then that when they first met the man who ended up abusing them, they thought he was their, quote, knight in shining armor, end quote. I mean, it's a term I've heard a lot because he does put them on a pedestal initially, and then it changes.
On top of that, then you have part of the abuser's toolbox is this idea of gaslighting, where they're constantly being told, well, if you just did this, or you made me do this. And, as a woman myself, I mean, I take those things personal. I want to be the best mother I can be. I want to be the best wife I can be. I want to be the best worker. So when someone says something like that, I definitely take that serious. I think that's important to do. But we're not responsible for someone else's behavior like that.
I think that brings up another point that is, to me, really significant, again, because I've heard so many survivors talk about how they tried to change to accommodate, that if they could just be perfect, then the abuser would no longer be abusive. If they just did everything perfectly right. But that process is insidious and it's incremental. And it's, just to give an example, it's an example I've heard, we got on an elevator, a couple got on an elevator and she said, when we got off the elevator, he said, I saw you looking at that guy. You were like coming onto that guy on the elevator, looking at him. I just can't trust you at all. You are always flirting with people and, why do you do that? And, you are unfaithful to me. And so what happens, though, the next time she gets on an elevator? She looks down. She doesn't dare meet anybody's eyes. I've heard that described with waiters too, if it's a male waiter. Mm-hmm. I saw you looking at that waiter. And so you end up making small changes, trying to accommodate, believing that if you, he just loves me so much, he's really jealous. So if I just don't give any reason for him to be jealous, then, he won't be that way anymore. But the accommodation continues for years. And I've heard survivors say eventually they looked in the mirror and they didn't even know who the person was who they were looking at, because they had accommodated so much. They'd given up so much of themselves and their freedoms and who they were.
And I think it's interesting you say that, because I just have to say, if my husband said those things to me, I would laugh at him and think he was joking, or I might say you're crazy and just walk away. But these women, we have to remember they don't have the luxury of responding in those ways, right? They've learned that if they do one thing wrong, there will be consequences, and it might be physical consequences, it might be threats, it might be to someone, not even to her, it might be to someone like a child or someone she cares about. I think it's really, I like your word insidious, how it sort of sneaks up. There's this sort of, I almost call it like a training in the beginning. So there's all this attention and monopolizing of attention, and there's some of it, and a lot of it's really good, but there are also little sort of corrections, like the jealousy, which is a big excuse for one, and then but lots with that love. And so, but by the time you kind of move toward that, where you're talking about in the relationship, they've learned hard lessons about how they are to respond too.
Absolutely. Yes. You've lost the freedom to respond honestly.
Absolutely. You're not yourself anymore.
Should we listen to another clip?
So it graduated and got worse and worse and worse. And I think one of the reasons that he escalated his force, my mother resisted more. And she resisted more to protect us. And my stepfather was very physically abusive to my brother, and a lot of abuse. He broke his nose and really worked him over the years. And then he physically worked on me as well, but not nearly as bad as my brother. And my three sisters. There was some physical abuse, and obviously just the exposure was enough for anybody. So police would come to our house, and I remember the very first time I saw a police officer on the front steps of our home. We were living in South Dallas, and neighbors called. Officer stepped on the front step, and my mother and I went out, and I was standing there with her, holding on to her, and he threatened to arrest her without even asking who we were. He said, if I come back, I'll lock everybody up. And she just shook. I could feel her. I can feel her right now. She just shook. And I felt that many times with my mother over the years. So here's what we did. After the officer left, we just sort of faded away. I mean, we moved and moved and moved, and we'd go somewhere, and the community didn't know what to do with us, as the police didn't know what to do with us, so we were kind of a gypsy family. And it got worse. She had 2 miscarriages. I mean, he beat her to miscarriage. Threw her out of a car one night downtown Dallas. She looked dead. We took her to the hospital, and she survived that. The moment, I think, because my brother left, he ran away, he went to Vietnam. I had a moment with my brother. We were in the airport in Dallas. He was going to Vietnam. I mean, he was going to war. And I was worried about it. I was scared for him. And he said, I'm really happy to get out of the house. So he ran to war to get out of the home filled with violence. So the thing that sort of ended it, and it's years and years and years of abuse. The thing that ended it one night, I was standing in the living room. We were living in Lancaster, Texas, as I remember, and he hit her in the kitchen. He hit her with his fist in the kitchen, and he knocked her out. And the strike to her face sounded like a gunshot. It's got a really big hand. And she went down the kitchen floor. And I stepped in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen. I saw her laying on the floor covered in blood. And I thought, well, she's dead. He's killed her. And I watched him, and I was like invisible to him. He didn't see me. And he stepped over and opened the refrigerator and pulled out a can of beer and opened it and started drinking it. And then he just turned and walked out onto the porch of our house. And I got a rag in the sink and wiped her face, and her eyes blinked, and she pulled herself up, and there was a steak knife on the kitchen counter, and she was going to stab him, and wrestled the knife out of her hand, and she went to the back bedroom, and I was playing Little League baseball, and I had a baseball bat, and she picked it up, she walked by me, and she kicked the screen door open, and she hit him behind the right ear, cracked his skull, exploded his eardrum. He falls off a porch, and he fell on top of a bicycle that I owned. I was throwing paper, so he broke my bike, and now I'm really upset. And I'm in the yard dragging him off my bike, and the police are already there. And they hear me say, "Get off my bike, you bastard." And they see my mother covered in blood, waving a bat at this man. I don't know what they thought. They took us all down to a little station there, and this old desk sergeant listened to the story, and he told these two officers to lock him up for public drunkenness and take him home. That's the way they dealt with domestic violence then. They could have arrested us, but they didn't, and that was it. That's when we ran. And we basically left with the clothes on our back, not much more than that, and made it back. Because my mother and I believe my sister Juanita was with us, and 2 dogs and a goldfish. And we didn't stop until we got to Tennessee. So we left Texas, and it was like we'd been in a prison for 10 years. It was like we were escaping. And I remember when I can see it right now, and I was just a little small kid, well, I was a teenager, 13. And we drove across that river bridge in Memphis, and it was like the gates of heaven. We finally made it home, and we hid. He tried to find us, he couldn't, and finally we found out a few years later he died of TB in a TB hospital in Tyler, Texas. So I struggled with it. You don't get out of this unscathed, as they say. I had mixed emotions and feelings about why me, why us, why my family, why we stayed. And I already loved my mother, but I loved her even more after that, when I realized what she was enduring was for me and my brother and sisters. She wasn't perfect, but she was to me. And her insistence that this was wrong and we were going to make it and get out, I can hear it right now. So when I talk to police who say they're frustrated, I acknowledge it. I know they are. But they cannot be as frustrated as my mother was, or any other woman who's living in silence and can't speak and can't talk about it. So
I want to point out one other thing, and just because whenever we talk about leaving or escaping, it's so important, especially if the abuser is someone who stalks, that it doesn't end there, that people can escape or leave, but if the person continues to stalk, harass, abuse, interfere with their lives, it just is an ongoing, extremely difficult situation. So I know that one of the hardest things for people is deciding when to escape an abusive relationship. But then if it continues after that, I have known survivors who went back because they were being stalked, and they had to constantly look over their shoulder and wonder when he was going to show up or what was going to happen next. And at least if, as one woman described to me, if we lived together, I knew when he went to work, I knew that my daughters and I could have peace all day, that he was going to be at work. I knew when he was going to come home. I knew what his mood was, and there weren't the same surprises. Yes, I was still being abused, but I wasn't afraid he was going to come in through a window or, somehow be hiding in my house when I got home. So it's one of the things that makes it really difficult when people place expectations or judgments on people in an abusive relationship about, why doesn't she just leave? Or, thinking what they would do in that situation. But if they were in that situation, there's a good chance they'd be making the same decision she's making right there. She is weighing her options, and she is trying to figure out the best and safest way to carry on with her and her children's lives.
This whole idea where you don't know what he's thinking, you don't know where he's going to pop up next, you don't know what he's going to do or who he's going to target because of you next, that is a terrible, awful, high anxiety place to be, this looming vulnerability. I think that people don't talk about enough is, well, two things. One, women are alive, so they're doing a good job because they're surviving. And two, we never ask that question, in my opinion. We certainly don't ask it enough. Why doesn't he just leave her alone? She's left. She said what she wants. Just leave her alone. But we don't ask that. We always focus on what the victim has done, is doing, or is going to do. It's always surrounds that, and it just drives me a little bit crazy.
Me too. And especially if then it goes to judgments about protecting children. The question should always be, obviously you and the children survived. How have you done that? What have you done? What mechanisms have you set in place to protect yourselves? And what help do you need to increase your safety? And if you ask those questions, you'll find people very consciously make decisions around how they and the children can be safer, and what decisions will make them the safest that they can be. So, the other question we need to ask is, what do you need to be able to escape safely? How can we help?
And I love that. And the other thing that you taught me way back, Teri, when you were working in the community to try to make things better for victims, and everybody's batting around, well, what if we try this? What if we try that? And you always said it always goes back to, will this make victims safer? And that's always your threshold for making any changes, any services, any decisions about how to best help people. Will it make them safer?
And ask them what will make them safer, because
and including their input. Absolutely.
Yeah, don't just think, I really think this will make her safer, so I'm going to tell her to do this. No, ask her what will make her safer, and give options for sure. But
yeah, because what works for one person might not work for another. I mean, that's the other thing I think it's kind of hard to understand, is that everybody comes into these relationships with different backgrounds, the partner and the victim. Everybody's dynamic of the abuse, the tactics, the specific tactics that are used, because the abusers use the ones that work for that person in that situation. Mm-hmm. And then looking at that dynamic, sort of his tactic, her response, what works, what doesn't, and so these situations, I mean, in a way, they have similarities, but we have to remember that just because something works for one person doesn't mean it's going to work for another person in terms of keeping them safe, or their biggest fears, or what they think about their options are, and things like that.
Absolutely. And that is a really major point, because what works for one people could actually endanger another person. Mm-hmm. And, from the outside, we can't make that assessment. And so having a variety of options is really great, but we can never assume what any other person should do. They, you ask, what are you afraid of? What are you fearful that is going to happen? What do you think he might do?
Then you have to keep asking, because that changes over time as well.
Yes, it does. The situation is fluid, and it changes, and you're right. You have to keep asking and keep offering whatever options might be appropriate. Let's listen to Mark's comments about when his mom decided the time was right to escape.
What was that moment that convinced my mother to get out? I think there was a combination. I think she had just gotten to her limit. She realized that he was going to kill her. And I think also, and she and I talked about this, I think she truly believed that as I got older, I would kill him, or my brother would. But I think she saw in us, the potential for our lives to be completely ruined, and she escaped. We escaped. We didn't leave. It wasn't a separation. It was an escape. Your question about that moment, it is like the $64,000 question. If we knew that moment that convinced women to leave, that's exactly what we recreate for women. But that's not reality. Those moments are different for every single woman who's living in domestic violence right now in the United States. And it has to be their moment. Because leaving, as you know, is a process, not an event. So where in that process did she realize she can get out? She has the resources. She has the strength, the courage, the plan, and the moment to leave without retaliation. Plus, there's the other dilemma. My mother loved my stepfather. She would never have married him if she hated him. So there was a conflict with her all her life as well. How do I love this man and survive his abuse, but how do I save my children from his abuse? Well, it was a little harder for her in those years because there weren't a lot of resources. I mean, we were separated from our family. But it was a constant conflict. She was a good, caring woman, and she cared about her man. Sounds like a country song, doesn't it? But it didn't work out. She was hopeful, but she was hopeful with the wrong person. So we got out after the event where he hit her and knocked her out in the kitchen one day. And as time went on, she obviously realized she made the right decision because she got us out. And not too late, because I agreed with her assessment. I think I would have killed him. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today. You might be interviewing me by being a striped uniform with a number on it in some prison somewhere, because I believe that's where I would have ended up.
Love the way that Mark talks about these moments, but I think one of the things that stands out to me in that is, clearly the violence was escalating and getting worse and worse. I felt like just from that first, clip that, hey, this is moving toward he's going to kill her. He doesn't even care. She's laid out and knocked out on the kitchen counter, steps over to get a beer. He doesn't even care. He's going to kill her. But that's not why she left. She left to protect her kids, that she felt like the boys might have taken that. And I don't know, that just, that gives me goosebumps a little bit. That's what I meant. She just loved those kids so much, and she was trying her best to protect them given the limited options and resources she had. And I think the other thing that strikes me is, like, she left with the clothes on her back. That right there, how many of us would just literally walk away like that with nothing? We took nothing with us because, they didn't have much to begin with. So those belongings that she and those kids had meant the world to them. I don't know.
I think, you couple that Mark and his brother had made an attempt to kill the stepfather once before, that the brother had run away to Vietnam. I was in college during Vietnam, and I knew a lot of people who served, and it wasn't a place people were joyful about going. Obviously, if he was going to war to escape the violence in his home, it was very significant, because his life was definitely going to be at risk in Vietnam, highly at risk. you couple those things with maybe particularly the sons getting older and more capable of fighting back. And anyone who has worked in domestic violence for any period of time knows that it's extremely common for children, and particularly sons as they get older, to try to protect their mother. So I think he's right. I think what he says would have happened probably would have happened if the situation had continued. So she probably knew it was a breaking point when she escaped.
Yeah, and there's another piece to this, and it's just like, I think all of us can relate to this, that when we love somebody, whether it's a sister, a close friend, anyone, someone in our parents, grandparents, whatever, when we see them being abused and hurt by another person, and we don't know how to help them. I mean, it's just such a miserable place to be. So that the brother going off to war, maybe it was self-protection, but maybe it was also just like, he can't watch this anymore, and he didn't know how to make it better. He didn't know how to change anything, so he had to take those steps for himself. I don't know. And I think the other thing that gets discounted that Mark brings up a lot is just her love for her husband. I mean, and that, in all of the years that I've studied domestic violence, I feel like that is something, it is hard to understand, but it definitely plays a role in that entrapment. You love this person, you don't want to hurt them, even though the victims have been hurt. I can't tell you how many would say, I wouldn't call the police because I don't want to see him in jail, I don't want to see him hurt.
It also happens more often than one would want to think that the abuser, when they can feel the other person pulling away and possibly getting ready to leave, they threaten suicide. If you leave me, I will kill myself. And that threat places a large burden on the other person. When someone tells me that their abuser has threatened that, what I really hear is a threat to them too, because I don't see the message as, I'm afraid you don't love me anymore, so I want to get out of your way so you can go on and have a happy, fulfilled life. So I'm afraid that what it means is, I do want to take myself out, but you're going first. And of course, we know that homicide suicides are not uncommon. I mean, they're not, of course, most cases don't end lethally, but it does happen, and it happens way more often than we like to acknowledge even. But anyway, when someone threatens suicide, it's kind of the ultimate threat, because I believe it is a threat to the other person.
Gavin de Becker, The Gift of Fear, where he talks about all these characteristics of dangerous people. And the one that sticks out to me is a guy who has nothing to lose. He doesn't care about going to jail, and he doesn't care about dying. That is the most dangerous person of all. And I cannot understand how professionals who deal with dangerous people every day can't see that. It just always is so interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. When we asked Mark what gave him hope as a child, that he, his mom, and siblings would survive, hope that they could have a future without the constant threat of violence from their stepfather, this is what Mark told us.
I think for me and my family, the hope came from one another. I think, siblings who live in violence day in, day out, they bond a little different. I suppose it's very much like what POWs go through. Matter of fact, I've heard actual POWs in conferences talk about their experience, and it's a mirror image of how you learn how to survive, how you learn meaning of words people say, their voice, their demeanor, their body language, their attitudes, their language. All of it has got specific meaning, so you read it. So you bond together as children when you're reading somebody to stay alive. So we gave each other hope. I love my sisters and brother very much. It impacted all of us differently. I can tell as an adult now the little things that they do in their lives that was a direct impact and reflection of their childhood. I was hopeful because my mother instilled me in hope. She was very funny, very positive personality. She didn't drink. Even though she lived a depressing life, you couldn't tell it. She was a perfect role model for a child victim of domestic violence. So we never gave up, and because of her, and she got out. She delivered eventually, and because I lived it, it's easier for me to tell police officers that it may seem futile, it may be frustrating, it may seem like what you do is not working, but there is hope that victims will get out. So be consistent, be patient, be understanding, and you give the victims hope and encouragement in your voice. They'll use that when they decide to get out. They won't forget what you say. So that's my sort of view and understanding of what hope is. And it was precious for us. I mean, it really was. I mean, it was like if we didn't have it and she didn't instill us in it, into us, I don't know what would happen to me.
So I just love to hear Mark talking about the hope he got from his mother and the role model she was, and from his siblings. They had just such a strong bond, and like he said, they never gave up. They believed that at some point they would get out and be together and not have to deal with this abusive person anymore. And like he said, his mother delivered. Mark, looked at their situation and that they did survive this, just seemingly insurmountable, unsurvivable situation that went on for a decade. But they did. And they did it together, and they're still really close. And I know Mark remained very, very close to his mother throughout her life. Mark credits her for inspiring him to transform his childhood trauma into a lifelong mission to do everything in his power to stop abusers and to be the advocate for survivors that he is. His mom passed away years ago, but I am so grateful to her for raising a man whose life has been dedicated to stopping domestic abuse and stalking. As a child, he couldn't stop his abusive stepfather, but through his work as an officer and a trainer, he has stopped countless abusers. In our next episode, we'll talk more about his work as an officer and some of the knowledge and insights he shares with the officers and advocates that he trains. If you are being stalked, you are not alone. According to a 2022 CDC report, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men in America have experienced stalking at some point during their lifetimes. For more information, tools and resources on stalking, and to hear all previous episodes in this series, go to outrageus.org. To find help in your area, contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE, S-A-F-E, or go to thehotline.org. This podcast was produced by Outrage Us Incorporated in partnership with the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History and the University of Kentucky Libraries. It was edited by Hilary Sykes.